Hi and welcome to History Legends. In this video, we'll do a step-by-step breakdown of Oversimplified World War I Part 2. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend you to watch Part 1. Although I understand how the channel wants to explain things as simple as possible, how accurate is it? And that's what you'll discover in this video.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down.
No. In 1915, the Allies had still plenty of troops available. They were convinced that they could break through German lines and go back to a war of movement.
The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions.
Why don't they show German colonies? This portrays a very biased perspective of the balance of power. I honestly think they should have rather shown a population map, since apart from India, most of these colonies were pretty empty of people.
And the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food.
I'm pretty disappointed because he missed a beautiful opportunity to show how the Germans actually tried to solve this food problem. German chemists devised substitutes for regular foods. They made fake bread, even fake sausages, although people didn't like them. These contained about 5% fat, no meat, leaving the rest of the content to be filled with salt, vegetable leaves, and mostly water. Doesn't sound pretty appetizing.
Neither side really wanted a long grueling war though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number 1, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea.
Fun fact, this was Australia's first independent combat action. And the other thing I find interesting is how a German lieutenant called Hermann Denzer and some 70 men evaded capture and only surrendered in January 1919.
The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans.
I'm a bit picky, but this is not a World War I picture, rather a World War II picture of the King's African Rifles. The description says, troops of the 11th East African Division on the road to Kalewa in Burma. Since the beginning of World War I, the British did not have that many African units, nor did they want to, and rather sent Indian troops to Africa. Now it's true that the Germans lost most of their colonies right at the beginning in 1914. But German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, held out until the end of the war under the command of von Lettow-Vorbeck. He could speak local dialects, and from 1914 to 1918, with a force of about 14,000, 3,000 Germans and 11,000 native Africans called Askaris, he held in check a much larger force of 300,000 British, Indian, Belgian, and Portuguese troops. With no supplies or reinforcements from Germany, he was even strong enough to organize a raid into British Northern Rhodesia in 1918. Imagine what would have happened if the Allies had sent these 300,000 men on the Western Front.
Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia,
which would prove very useful during World War II.
Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war.
Yeah, that's more or less what happened. But you have to remember that the traditional enemy of Italy throughout the 19th century, their birth as a nation, was Austria. And Austria still held a lot of territory that Italy wanted, namely Trieste, Istria, Zara, and Dalmatia.
The power's new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottomans were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, whoops, looks like we're at war now.
Makes me think of how Japan entered World War II, or rather started the Sino-Japanese War, when a small extremist faction just attacked on their own and forced the entire country to go to war.
The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold and many of them froze to death.
Now put yourself in the shoes of Allied commanders. The Ottoman army lost against the Italians in 1912, they lost the Balkan Wars of 1912, and now they're losing against the Russians. For Allied commanders, it was time for the final blow and march on Constantinople.
Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed.
Honestly, in my opinion, Gallipoli was a great idea, and credits to Winston Churchill. From a strategic perspective, it could take out the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open up a vital route towards Russia and supply its war effort. However, the operation was poorly executed. There were some important hills that the Allies had to capture, but they preferred to let their men rest right after disembarking. Meanwhile, the Turks brought in reinforcements, and that was it.
The Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying US opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after.
I understand how this channel wants to simplify complicated topics, but now it's entering cliché territory and I don't like it. Basically, Germans equals bad guys. So yeah, maybe the Germans did bomb cities with Zeppelins, but was it more moral for the British to blockade Germany's food imports and force many civilians on the brink of starvation? And then again, nobody talks about the pogroms of the Russian army against Jews, or the massacres of Ukrainians and Serbs at the hand of the Austro-Hungarian army.
Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea.
Okay, that part was well explained. Out of the 400,000 people who set out on the journey, only 120,000 soldiers and 60,000 civilians reached the coast to be evacuated by Allied ships to the island of Corfu. As you will see, this is not the end of the war for Serbia.
It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit.
It's nice they talk about Portugal, but in the grand scheme of things, Portugal had a relatively minor role during World War I. I think they could have skipped that part. Instead, they could have talked about Canada's extraordinary involvement during World War I. Over 5% of its population was sent overseas. If you take out women, children, and the elderly, that's literally 1 in 5 men. It's insane.
Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again.
Yep, that's exactly what happened. A lot of countries do this when they have a very precious weapon and they don't want to waste it, so they end up never using it. Thing is, many countries still do this today.
The UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal.
Yeah, that's true. And you can imagine the consequences of sending herds of inexperienced men at the front. Before 1916, the British had what they called PALS battalions. Guys from the same neighborhoods, same factories, same football clubs that volunteered to go to war together. But it wasn't like playing Call of Duty with your buddies. Entire battalions would sometimes get wiped out in a day, and entire neighborhoods would be empty of young men. And most of these places never recovered. And the British Army stopped the pause battalions, mixed up the men, and never attempted such an experiment ever again.
The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day.
In a nutshell, that's what happened. But in my opinion, I feel he downplayed the significance of these battles. We don't understand why they happened. For example, why did the Germans attack at Verdun?
It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology.
And who's the man who pushed this idea? Our boy, Winston Churchill. And it's true, just like it's mentioned in the video, the first time tanks were used in battle was during the Somme. And I have to admit that it's a fact that I didn't know. In September 1916, 49 tanks appeared on the horizon. Only a third of them actually made it through the no man's land. But when commanders saw how these machines managed to cut through barbed wire, clear the way for infantry, and cross trenches, they ordered 1,000 more.
The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck.
I find it very easy to say how the Russian army simply ran out of supplies, but we often forget the sheer size of the battlefield on the Eastern Front. Verdun had a 30-kilometer front line. In comparison, during the Brusilov offensive, the Russians were deployed along 400 kilometers. Now, at the Somme, the furthest Allied advance was 8 kilometers, and it was already a supply nightmare. Now, during the Brusilov offensive, the Russians pushed 40 to 50 kilometers.
Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war. And then they got pounded.
I'm happy he mentioned Romania, and that's literally what happened. It mainly turned to shit when the Russians left the war. Because before that, in July 1917, the Romanian front had stabilized with 800,000 men on the front. And I think that if Russia had stayed a bit longer in the war with Romania by its side, the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans would not have been able to launch the Caporetto offensive. But in general, we tend to downplay the events in the Balkans or in the Eastern Front and solely focus on what happened on the Western Front.
The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies. After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive.
That's something else I learned. I didn't know about this schism between the king and the prime minister. I just find it odd because Turkey was part of the Central Powers. And Turkey was Greece's arch nemesis. They literally went to war 2 years before. Now, if you want to know more about the battles that took place in northern Greece, check out the Macedonian front. What I find crazy is that barely anyone talks about it. But I was lucky enough to visit the War Museum in Athens, which clearly explained what happened. The British were focused on the Middle East, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. So this forgotten army came under French command. Essentially, it was all the men that were evacuated from Gallipoli. But unlike most armies, it was a truly international mix. It was composed of 6 French divisions, 6 Serbian, 7 British, 1 Italian, 3 Greek, and 2 Russian brigades. And they would play a decisive role during World War I.
And they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad. But the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered.
The siege of Kut cost the British about 50,000 men. And this goes to show how they underestimated the Ottoman army. And I can tell you, they were much more careful after that.
A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply.
Lawrence of Arabia is today like a superstar. Everyone has heard of him. But it's important to note that he was one of many British and French officers sent to help the Arabs. But since T.E. Lawrence wrote about his involvement and heroic actions during the Arab Revolt in the book called The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, we only tend to remember him.
By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army.
First of all, by 1916, the French uniform was this, and not the bright red and blue anymore. Now, the mutinies of the French army is another event we tend to overemphasize. At the end of the day, it was 26 men that were executed for rebelling against orders in June and July 1917. Sadly, in comparison, in 1914, 125 French soldiers were shot. The next year, it increased to 237. Now, the mutinies of the French army had a side effect that I wish was mentioned in the video. Basically, no more frontal attacks like before, improved living conditions for soldiers, but above all, a push to modernize the army and the way to wage war. The French commanders had to find a way to win without losing as many men, namely more aircraft, more cannons, more tanks, and more trucks.
The German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone.
This is where a victory at Gallipoli could have changed everything. Imagine if all the British and French soldiers sent to Gallipoli were actually sent to Russia.
War. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd complete with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government.
Yes, so basically socialists under a man named Kerensky took over after the Tsar. But then you had far left extremists called the Bolsheviks under a man called Lenin, which would stage a coup against the socialist government.
And they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to...
Oh my god, he didn't mention it! Okay, for those that didn't know, in 1917, Lenin lived in exile in Switzerland, and he was unable to get to Russia during the initial revolution. But the German government saw him as a very useful troublemaker, and they let him through German territory, which he did, and the Germans really expected him to push Russia out of the war. It was the ultimate card to play, and no one saw it coming.
Focus on the Western Front, but there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe.
Although Congress declared war on Germany in April 1917, US troops only began combat operations in the summer of 1918, and were only really involved in fighting in October and November 1918, the last 2 months of the war. Now, talking about this telegram, I think it's completely out of touch to think that Mexico could have done anything during World War I, as they were caught in the middle of a bloody civil war.
This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks.
Once the Eastern Front was secured, what the Germans did was to bring all their men from the Eastern Front back to the West. Then they combined their best soldiers into elite units called stormtroopers. These would be thrown first into battle to punch through enemy lines. And for some time, it worked. But eventually, the Germans kept losing their best men and couldn't replenish these losses. They were running low on supplies, and every new offensive brought diminishing returns. Think of it a bit like the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans made good gains, but it ultimately tired out their army.
By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Power...
I can't believe it. He didn't even mention how warfare evolved from 1914 to 1918. The important thing to remember is that the German army had remained in a 1916 infantry-centric approach to the war, whereas the Allies heavily modernized. 1918 saw aircraft coordinating artillery strikes while tanks combined with infantry attacked enemy lines. By the end of 1918, the German army on the Western Front had all but collapsed. The French were notorious for using trucks to move their artillery and men from one sector to another, and the Germans just couldn't keep up. They still used trains to move their cannons and men, but these were constantly harassed by Allied aircraft.
Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on...
You see, that sudden collapse was due to this army in Greece we mentioned before. But we barely hear about it because the generals on the Western Front were so jealous of this military success that they kept it in the shadows. Basically, this army was under French General Franchet-Desprez. The offensive broke through Bulgarian lines, causing them to falter and capitulate. Then the British marched on Constantinople, which capitulated. And during that time, French and Serbian troops liberated Belgrade. And their scouts were already entering the Hungarian heartland. And since the Austro-Hungarian Empire had no more men to stop this advance, they also capitulated. Now Germany was completely alone, had no more army, and was getting encircled.
November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead, the world learnt its lesson and never had such an awful war again. For about 20 years.
The problem is that the French and General Pershing wanted to invade Germany and make plans for 1919. The goal was to really show the German people who won the war, because as of now, not a single inch of German territory had been conquered. But they didn't. And just like many expected, the Germans were resentful and made up claims how they did not lose and how they lost because of a stab in the back and all this. Overall, I think that part 1 was really good, but part 2 felt rushed and somewhat all over the place. Some unimportant events are blown out of proportion, whereas important events were not mentioned at all. And lastly, I have to mention that I feel that there is a strong American bias in this video, where he inflates the role of the United States in World War I. Overall, let me know what you thought of my analysis in the comment section below. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to help me create more content, don't forget to join my Patreon.